Summer 1940. Europe lay beneath the iron grip of the Reich, and only a battered island remained defiant. Across the channel, barges gathered in silence, their decks bristling with soldiers who believed they would soon walk the streets of London. Above, the Luftwaffe carved black scars across the sky, hunting the last defenders of Britain's airfields. In that moment, the world held its breath. If Britain fell, the light of resistance would vanish, and the path of history would bend, not toward liberation, but toward submission, conquest, and an empire of shadows. In the late summer of 1940, the fate of Europe balanced on the wings of aircraft. For months, the Luftwaffe and the Royal Air Force clashed over the skies of southern England in what history knows as the Battle of Britain. In our timeline, the RAF held firm, preventing Hitler's long-dreamed invasion. But in this darker thread of history, British air defences faltered. With radar stations crippled, airfields bombed into ruin, and exhausted fighter squadrons grounded, the Luftwaffe finally gained the decisive air superiority that German planners insisted was essential. On September 15, 1940, the order was given. Unternehmen Seelöwe, Operation Sea Lion, would commence. The invasion began under cover of pre-dawn fog. Across the channel, hastily converted Rhine barges, lashed together in long convoys, crept toward the English coast, escorted by Kriegsmarine torpedo boats and protected overhead by swarms of Messerschmitt Bf 109s. The Royal Navy, still a formidable force, scrambled to intercept. Destroyers from Portsmouth and Chatham steamed into the strait. But without air cover, they were sitting ducks. Stuka dive bombers screamed down upon them, tearing holes in their decks, sending crews into oily, burning waters. The once invincible shield of the Channel was shattered within hours. By midday, German troops were ashore near Dover and Folkestone. Paratroopers, deployed under Unternehmen Adler, secured bridges and crossroads inland, while panzer units, though slowed by the difficult beach landings, began pressing toward Canterbury. Civilian volunteers armed with hunting rifles and Molotov cocktails tried to resist, but their bravery was no match for disciplined Wehrmacht formations. The Home Guard, dismissed as Dad's army in peacetime jest, now fought grim street to street, battles in Kent villages, leaving burning cottages and shattered windows in their wake. The illusion of Britain as an untouchable fortress was gone. In London, the War Cabinet convened in deep shelters beneath Whitehall. Prime Minister Winston, Churchill's voice, gravelly and unbowed, still thundered over the BBC. "We shall fight them in the fields and in the streets." But his words were undermined by grim dispatches from the front. The RAF, desperate and bloodied, could no longer guarantee the skies. Fighter Command's reserves were depleted, losses mounted daily. For the first time since the Norman conquest, a foreign army had established a bridgehead on English soil. As the days unfolded, the Germans expanded their control. Ports along the Channel were seized, enabling heavier reinforcements to arrive. Supply lines remained tenuous, constantly harassed by what remained of the Royal Navy and coastal artillery. Yet Hitler's gamble began to pay dividends. London endured nightly raids, not just from bombers, but from artillery batteries ferried across the Channel. The city's population huddled in tube stations, emerging each morning to find their neighborhoods reduced to smoking rubble. In some quarters, defeatist whispers began to circulate. Perhaps Britain could not hold. The short-term consequences were catastrophic. The British Army, reconstituted after the evacuation at Dunkirk, found itself once again cut to pieces. Tank units stationed around Maidstone and Ashford tried to counter-attack, but without air support, they were shredded by German dive bombers before they could reach the beaches. Naval commanders demanded unrestricted action against the invasion fleet, but their warships were being lost at a rate that threatened the survival of the fleet itself. By late October, German troops had pushed within artillery range of London. Churchill pressed for a stand to the last man, but King George VI was already being courted by advisors urging relocation of the crown to Canada. In Berlin, Hitler saw vindication. His generals, many of whom had doubted the feasibility of sea, Lion now presented the invasion as a masterstroke. Goebbels prepared triumphant propaganda reels, the once mighty island empire humbled, her fields trampled by German boots. Plans circulated for the occupation of Britain, a puppet government under Oswald Mosley, internment of suspected dissidents, and the suppression of the BBC. The Gestapo prepared blacklists of intellectuals, politicians, and resistance leaders to be arrested immediately once London fell. But the long-term consequences extended far beyond the white cliffs of Dover. Without Britain as a staging ground, American policy shifted dramatically. President Roosevelt, facing an isolationist Congress, could no longer justify Lend-Lease at its historic scale. With Britain compromised, the United States lost its forward base for any European counteroffensive. The Atlantic lifeline was severed. Washington's gaze turned increasingly inward, even as events in Asia gathered storm clouds. When Japan advanced deeper into Southeast Asia, the American response came without the expectation of a Western partner to hold the line in Europe. The war's balance tilted irreversibly. In the colonies, the shock reverberated like a thunderclap. In India, nationalist leaders seized on Britain's humiliation as proof that the empire was not eternal. Across Africa and the Middle East, whispers of independence became open demands. Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, bound by loyalty to the Crown, faced impossible choices: to fight on alone or to negotiate their survival in a world where Germany dominated Europe and perhaps the Atlantic. The empire, once global and unshakable, stood at the edge of disintegration. For the Soviet Union, the fall of Britain was a nightmare realized. Stalin had hoped that Britain's stubborn defiance would keep Germany occupied in the West, buying Moscow precious time. Now, with the British Isles under the Reich's control, Hitler's gaze shifted eastward. Unternehmen Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union, would still come, but it would come without the distraction of Britain, without the attritional drain of the Battle of Britain, and with the industrial resources of a subdued Western Europe firmly in German hands. The Red Army would face the full might of a German war machine unburdened by a Western front. The Cold War, in this alternate trajectory, never emerged in the form we know. Instead, Europe was carved under Nazi dominance, its institutions reshaped to serve a continental Reich. America, uncertain and distant, fortified its hemisphere, but never gained the credibility to lead a Western alliance. The ideological struggle of the 20th century became one not between capitalism and communism, but between fascist domination and fragmented resistance movements scattered across colonies and occupied territories. The story of Operation Sea Lion, had it succeeded, is a study in cascading consequences. A single collapse of air defense in the summer of 1940, a single failure of fighter command to hold the line, might have rewritten the century. Britain, the stubborn holdout that became the staging ground for D-Day, the arsenal of hope in Europe's darkest hour, would instead be remembered as the fallen keystone of freedom's arch. And history would not record their finest hour, but rather their final one. As the German foothold in southern England spread, Whitehall became the centre of frantic contingency planning. Beneath the streets of London, inside the cabinet war rooms, discussions once theoretical now took on an air of inevitability. If the Wehrmacht breached the capital, what then? It was here, in smoke-filled chambers and under the flickering light of emergency lamps, that the outline of a desperate evacuation was prepared. Operation Banquet Light. Officially, it was never meant to be spoken of. Unofficially, it was the final escape hatch for Britain's leadership. The plan called for Churchill, the King, and selected members of the War Cabinet to be flown out under cover of night aboard RAF Hudson bombers to Scotland. From there, a chain of transports would carry them across the Atlantic to Ottawa, Canada. The Dominion would serve as the seat of a government in exile, preserving at least the semblance of continuity. But Churchill, stubborn as ever, railed against the very idea. He vowed to stay in London until the last German soldier was expelled, or until he himself was killed in the ruins of Downing Street. Only the persuasion of his generals and the knowledge that dead leaders cannot lead began to sway him. By late October 1940, the situation was untenable. German artillery shells, ferried across the Channel on captured British barges, now landed within miles of Westminster. Luftwaffe raids blanketed the city nightly, fires consuming entire districts. The RAF was collapsing into scattered remnants, its young pilots pushed beyond exhaustion. On October 27th, after a particularly devastating air raid that gutted much of Whitehall, the decision was made. Churchill, his cabinet, and a handful of military chiefs were escorted under blackout to RAF Northolt. Waiting in the dark, engines, ticking softly, were the planes that would carry them into reluctant exile. Accounts from crewmen describe a somber departure. The Prime Minister, clad in his signature overcoat and Homburg, carried a single dispatch box clutched under his arm. He refused to remove the ever-present cigar, though he did not light it until airborne. As the Hudson bomber lifted off into the smoke-stained night sky, he looked down at the burning city. London, the city he had sworn to defend, was slipping from his grasp. He is reported to have muttered only one phrase: "We shall return." The consequences of Churchill's flight were immediate. Morale in London plummeted. The image of their bulldog Prime Minister standing defiant in the ruins had sustained the civilian population through the Blitz. Now, with word spreading that he had fled, even if only to continue the fight from abroad, many saw it as abandonment. German propaganda seized the moment, broadcasting sneering reports that the so-called Lion of Britain has scurried to Canada. The myth of indomitable resistance cracked, and whispers of surrender grew louder in the surviving corridors of government. In Ottawa, the new seat of the British government in exile, Churchill tried to project confidence. He delivered radio addresses assuring the Empire that the struggle was not lost, that Britain's colonies and dominions would rally, and that one day they would liberate the homeland. But the truth was harsher. Canada and Australia pledged support, but their military resources were limited. Without Britain as a fortress base, logistics collapsed. Supplies that once flowed across the Atlantic now had no safe harbor. The United States, still neutral and wary of entanglement, looked upon Churchill's broadcasts with skepticism. To many in Washington, Britain was no longer a viable partner, merely a broken empire gasping from across the sea. In the occupied zones of England, meanwhile, the vacuum left by Churchill's departure grew. A collaborationist provisional authority began to emerge, encouraged by German overseers. Oswald Mosley, leader of the British Union of Fascists, stepped from the margins into prominence. With German backing, he styled himself as the figure who could maintain order under occupation. The thought of blackshirts patrolling British streets, once unthinkable, now became a grim reality. Resistance groups formed in the countryside, but without central leadership, they were scattered and vulnerable to infiltration. What had been Britain's proud boast, its refusal to bow, dissolved under the weight of occupation. The long-term implications were profound. Without Churchill in London to personify resistance, Britain's role as the beating heart of Allied defiance evaporated. Roosevelt, though sympathetic, could not convince Congress to extend further aid to what many now saw as a lost cause. The Lend-Lease Act, if it passed at all, would focus more heavily on the Soviet Union, but even there American hesitation grew. The idea of a grand alliance never materialized. Instead, the United States drifted toward a defensive posture, fortifying its hemisphere while Germany consolidated its dominance over Europe. For the Soviet Union, the absence of a British counterweight was a strategic disaster. Stalin had hoped Britain's endurance would keep Germany tied down in the West. Instead, with Britain effectively neutralized and its government reduced to exile status, Hitler faced east with a freer hand. Unternehmen Barbarossa still launched. In June 1941, but this time without the drain of defending the Channel or the constant bombing attrition over Germany, the Wehrmacht advanced even deeper, striking not just toward Moscow, but with extended logistical confidence. Without Britain pressuring Germany's western flank, the Red Army's position grew more precarious than ever. The empire itself began to unravel. India, already restless under colonial rule, seized on Britain's collapse as proof of imperial weakness. Leaders like Gandhi and Nehru, emboldened by the vacuum of authority, pressed their demands for independence more forcefully. In Africa, nationalist movements grew in strength. Canada and Australia, though loyal, recognized that the mother country was no longer the power it once was. The very notion of a united Commonwealth seemed fragile, stretched across oceans without a secure core in London. Churchill's exile marked more than a tactical retreat. It symbolized the end of Britain's role as a global superpower. His speeches from Ottawa, broadcast to the Empire, carried the same defiant cadence, but the world heard them differently. They were the words of a man cut off from his people, a leader without a homeland. The bulldog spirit survived, but in exile it became a faint echo rather than a rallying cry. History would remember Churchill not as the leader who stood unyielding in the ruins, but as the man who fled to fight another day. Only that day would never truly come. The Cold War, in this alternate future, did not pit the Western democracies against Soviet communism. Instead, it evolved into a contest between two uneasy giants, a fascist Reich that ruled Europe unchallenged, and a United States that fortified its hemisphere while retreating from global commitments. Britain, reduced to a government in exile in Canada, became a relic of a lost world order. Its empire disintegrated piece by piece, its colonies seizing the moment to break free. What remained was the memory of a nation that might have stood, but instead fell, its leaders airborne in the night, leaving behind a burning capital and a people abandoned to occupation. Among the archives captured in Berlin at the war's end, there surfaced whispers of negotiations that never officially existed. Documents stamped with the insignia of the German Foreign Ministry, notes scribbled by intermediaries, and fragments of encoded transmissions all pointed toward a chilling possibility. That Britain, broken by invasion and the relentless bombing of its cities, considered suing for peace. In the autumn of 1940, with Churchill gone into exile and London reeling, a faction within Britain's establishment explored what came to be codenamed Operation Dove. It was a proposal to end the war not in victory, but in accommodation. The architects of the plan were not the bulldog loyalists of Churchill's cabinet, but elements within the aristocracy, business circles, and even members of the royal court who had long feared communism more than fascism. King Edward VIII, forced to abdicate in 1936, had openly sympathized with Hitler's Germany. His circle of confidence still wielded quiet influence. The Germans, through diplomatic backchannels in neutral Switzerland and Sweden, dangled the possibility of terms. Britain would retain much of its empire, its navy, and its monarchy, so long as it recognized Germany's supremacy on the continent and refrained from interfering in European affairs. To exhausted officials in London, it was a devil's bargain, but one that promised survival. The negotiations were tentative, shadowed in secrecy. Meetings in Lisbon and Madrid, mediated by Spanish diplomats sympathetic to the Axis, outlined the contours. Germany demanded recognition of its control over France, Belgium, and the Low Countries, as well as the withdrawal of British forces from the Mediterranean. In exchange, Britain would be spared occupation, its overseas territories left largely intact. The Reich's propaganda machine prepared for the announcement of a peace of honor, presenting it not as Britain's capitulation, but as a noble recognition of the new European order. Inside Britain, the debate tore at the nation's soul. Collaborators argued that peace was pragmatic, that the empire's survival depended on accommodation. They pointed to the smouldering ruins of Coventry, the firestorms over London, and the invasion forces pressing toward the Midlands. Could a nation already on its knees truly endure another year of slaughter? Yet others recoiled at the thought. Resistance groups, elements of the Labour Party, and scattered remnants of the RAF swore they would never accept subjugation. The divisions fractured Britain's unity, creating the conditions for a civil struggle within the shell of a defeated state. In December 1940, a delegation operating under cover of diplomatic exchange flew from London to Stockholm. Their message was clear. Britain would consider peace. In Berlin, the reaction was one of satisfaction, tempered with caution. Hitler, ever suspicious, demanded concrete guarantees. He ordered drafts prepared that envisioned a Britain bound in treaty, its empire intact, but its foreign policy shackled. Joseph Goebbels planned the announcement, picturing Hitler as a magnanimous conqueror who had chosen mercy over annihilation. "We will give them peace, and the world will thank us for our restraint," he noted in his diary. The short-term consequences were devastating for the Allied cause. Roosevelt, informed through intelligence intercepts that Britain was negotiating, was furious. The image of Britain as the last bastion of resistance had been central to his argument for Lend-Lease. Now, with Britain seemingly capitulating, Congress seized upon the news to justify non-intervention. Why should American factories churn out weapons for a nation that had already bent the knee? Isolationists in the Senate gained the upper hand, and US foreign policy drifted back toward hemispheric defense, leaving Europe to its fate. The Soviet Union, too, watched with dread. Stalin, calculating and cold, understood the implications immediately. A Britain at peace with Germany meant no Western distraction, no second front, and no lifeline of supplies through the Atlantic. When Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa in 1941, the Red Army would face the Wehrmacht without hope of Western relief. The Soviet gamble to buy time through the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact had collapsed. Now, the eastward thrust of Nazi expansion would come with the confidence of a Reich secure in its western flank, bolstered by Britain's withdrawal from the struggle. Domestically, Britain's acceptance of peace sparked unrest. Resistance groups labelled the settlement a betrayal. Underground presses circulated leaflets declaring the government illegitimate, urging sabotage and rebellion against collaborationist authorities. The Gestapo, already embedded in occupied zones, coordinated with Britain's special branch to root out dissent. Prisons filled with those who refused to bow to the new order. The once proud island nation that had vowed to fight on became a divided land, one half compliant, the other living in shadows, waiting for a moment to rise again. In Troy. The longer arc of history, the Eagles deal reshaped the world. The British Empire survived in form, but hollowed of credibility. India, emboldened by the weakness of its colonial masters, accelerated its push for independence. Across Africa and the Middle East, nationalist leaders saw the peace as proof that Britain's time had ended. Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, tied by loyalty yet disillusioned, began charting independent foreign policies. The empire did not collapse overnight, but the glue that held it together, Britain's aura of invincibility, had dissolved. For Germany, the deal secured a continental hegemony. With Britain neutralized, Hitler's regime faced no credible Western enemy. Resources poured eastward. The Reich expanded its industrial exploitation, drawing on conquered Europe with impunity. By the mid-1940s, Germany envisioned a Europe reorganized under the Neuordnung, the New Order. Britain, spared total destruction, became a subordinate power, nominally sovereign, but in practice a satellite bound by treaty to Berlin's will. Its empire became a tool of German strategy, a vast reservoir of raw materials feeding the war machine. The Cold War of this alternate future was not the bipolar struggle of our history. Instead, it emerged as a contest between the fascist, bloc-dominating Europe and the defensive isolationism of the United States. Stalin's Soviet Union, bleeding under the relentless assault of an undistracted Wehrmacht, struggled for survival. If Moscow endured, it did so at staggering cost, and without the Western allies that in our reality provided lifelines of aid. The ideological fault line of the 20th century was redrawn. Democracy receded, fascism ascended, and the few remaining free nations stood isolated on the margins. The Eagles deal was not just a hypothetical peace. It was the slow suffocation of a nation's spirit. Britain, the island fortress that once declared it would never surrender, instead signed away its defiance in the shadows of Stockholm and Lisbon. For those who believed in the myth of their finest hour, the truth of this alternate history is a bitter inversion. Not finest, but final. Not defiance, but accommodation. A story not of victory carved from resistance, but of survival purchased at the cost of honor. And from that transaction, the 20th century would have been reshaped in ways we can scarcely imagine. When Britain fell into silence, the sound carried across the Atlantic like a tolling bell. For President Franklin D. Roosevelt, the collapse of the last European democracy left him staring into the abyss. For years, he had maneuvered delicately, trying to steer an isolationist Congress toward aid for Britain, while promising the American public that their boys would not be sent to fight in Europe's wars. Britain's survival had been his linchpin argument, that the fight was not hopeless, that the arsenal of democracy could arm a valiant ally standing alone. But with London in flames, Churchill in exile, and whispers of a British-German peace deal circulating through diplomatic channels, that linchpin snapped. Now Roosevelt faced a paralyzing reality. America was alone, and the will to act was crumbling. In the halls of Congress, isolationists seized the moment with ruthless efficiency. Senator Gerald Nye, Charles Lindbergh, and the America First Committee declared vindication. Their speeches filled radio waves, proclaiming that the Atlantic was America's true defense and that Europe had chosen its fate. Without Britain as a partner, they argued, intervention would be madness. The Lend-Lease Act, still crawling its way through committee hearings, was gutted. Tanks and planes earmarked for Britain were mothballed in American depots, left to gather dust. Roosevelt's vision of the United States as the arsenal of democracy dissolved before his eyes. "We cannot be the arsenal of a ghost," one congressman sneered. Roosevelt's frustration boiled behind closed doors. Intelligence reports from the Office of Strategic Services painted a dire picture. German control consolidating in France and the Low Countries. The Royal Navy bottled up or surrendered. Britain's colonies drifting toward independence. To lose. Britain was not just to lose an ally. It was to lose the Atlantic lifeline, the forward base that had made any future American re-entry into Europe conceivable. Without it, the Atlantic became a fortress wall, and beyond it stretched an Axis-dominated continent. In public, Roosevelt continued to speak of vigilance, of strengthening American defenses, of supporting freedom where possible. But the tenor of his voice changed. Gone was the confidence that America could tip the balance in Europe. Instead, his rhetoric turned toward hemispheric defense, invoking the Monroe Doctrine and promising that no Axis power would be allowed to threaten the Americas. It was a retreat in spirit, even as the nation accelerated its military buildup. American factories churned out warplanes, but their destination was no longer Britain. They now sat in warehouses or were diverted to bolster US Army air forces. Battleships steamed along the coasts, not across the Atlantic. The arsenal of democracy became the arsenal of America alone. The consequences of hesitation were immediate in Europe. Deprived of American supplies, resistance movements across occupied France and Belgium withered on the vine. The flow of rifles, explosives, and radios that had sustained them in our timeline never arrived. German security services tightened, their grip crushing cells before they could grow. Without the promise of Allied liberation, recruitment faltered. The underground became little more than scattered bands of desperate men, hunted relentlessly by the Gestapo. The myth of liberation faded into silence. For Stalin, the implications were terrifying. Soviet intelligence, ever attuned to shifts in the balance of power, reported the death of British resistance with alarm. The Red Army had relied upon the idea that Germany would remain tied down in the West, its Luftwaffe and Kriegsmarine bleeding resources to contain Britain. Now, with the island neutralized, Hitler's focus turned entirely eastward. When Unternehmen Barbarossa was unleashed in June 1941, it came with overwhelming force, 3 million men, supported by divisions and material that in our history had been diverted to the Channel coast. The blow struck deeper, faster, and more devastatingly than even Stalin's worst fears. Without Anglo-American aid in the form of trucks, fuel, and rations, the Soviet Union teetered on the edge of annihilation. American hesitation became Soviet calamity. Meanwhile, Japan watched the shifting tides with calculating eyes. Without Britain holding the line in Asia, the imperial ambitions of Tokyo expanded unchecked. Singapore, once the Gibraltar of the East, was abandoned, its defenses collapsing as Britain's empire fractured. Malaya and Burma became ripe targets. In Washington, the debate over how to handle Japan grew more urgent, but isolationist. Voices argued that Britain's weakness proved America must avoid foreign entanglements. Even the Pearl Harbor attack of December 1941, in this altered timeline, met with a muted response. America retaliated, yes, but with no European ally to protect, and a Congress wary of two-front war, US strategy shifted toward a Pacific First posture, leaving Europe in Germany's grasp. The long-term ripple effects of America's hesitation reshaped the post-war world. Without a D-Day, without Normandy, there was no Allied liberation of France. Germany consolidated its hold, integrating occupied territories into the Reich's economy. By the mid-1940s, Hitler's vision of a Grossraumwirtschaft, a vast continental economic sphere, was no longer theory but reality. The industrial heart of Europe, from the Ruhr to the Balkans, functioned as a single war machine. America, isolated across the Atlantic, fortified its hemisphere, but abandoned the dream of shaping Europe's destiny. At home, Roosevelt's political fortunes shifted. His opponents painted him as a dreamer who had gambled on Britain and lost. The election of 1944 saw a resurgent Republican Party capitalize on isolationist sentiment, ushering in a government determined to focus on domestic recovery and hemispheric defense. The United States still grew into a superpower, but one hemmed in by oceans, wary of global commitments, and resigned to coexistence with a fascist Europe. The Cold War that followed bore little resemblance to the one we know. Instead of NATO, there was no Western alliance. Instead of Berlin divided, there was a Berlin absorbed into the Reich. The confrontation of the 20th century became a standoff between a fascist Europe and an America sealed in its hemisphere, with the Soviet Union, if it survived at all, staggering under the weight of German assault. The world's ideological struggle was no longer democracy versus communism, but democracy isolated against fascism ascendant. American hesitation in 1940 was not merely a political delay, it was the decision point that rewrote the century. Had Roosevelt been able to rally Congress, had the United States stepped forward in Britain's darkest hour, the arc of history might have bent differently. But in this alternate history, America flinched, and in that hesitation, the opportunity to halt fascism before it consumed the world slipped forever from its grasp. The fall of Britain reverberated across the globe with seismic force. For centuries, the British Empire had projected itself as eternal, a dominion upon which the sun never set. But in 1940, as German forces entrenched themselves along the southern coast of England and the Union, Jack fluttered under foreign occupation. The illusion of permanence shattered. The empire, stretched across continents, suddenly found its heart hollowed. Without London's steady hand, colonies and dominions faced a stark question. Would they fight for a broken homeland, or seize the chance to claim independence? In India, the tremors were immediate. Nationalist leaders who had long pressed for self-rule interpreted Britain's defeat as the definitive proof of imperial weakness. Mahatma Gandhi, Jawaharlal Nehru, and Subhas Chandra Bose saw opportunity in the void. The Quit India movement, which in our history erupted 2 years later, ignited almost overnight. Bose, emboldened by Axis advances, sought direct German and Japanese support, envisioning an Indian liberation army fighting alongside Axis powers to expel Britain's remnants. In Delhi and Calcutta, British administrators found themselves besieged, not only by political strikes, but by riots demanding the end of colonial rule. For the first time, British rule in India appeared mortally vulnerable. In Africa, the cracks widened. Across Nigeria, Kenya, and South Africa, nationalist voices grew louder. British promises of eventual self-governance rang hollow now that Britain itself was shackled. South Africa, with its powerful Afrikaner nationalist movement, debated openly whether to break away and align with Germany. Smuts, once a loyal Commonwealth statesman, found his authority challenged by factions demanding neutrality or even collaboration with the Axis. The empire's vast African territories, long exploited as reservoirs of men and resources, now became contested ground. Without Britain's ability to project naval power, supply routes faltered and the empire's grip slackened. The Middle East too teetered. In Egypt, resentment of British military presence swelled, and nationalist groups pressed for independence. Iraq and Iran, strategic for their oil, sensed the shifting balance. German propaganda flooded the region, promising liberation from colonial yokes. With Britain unable to reinforce the Suez Canal, Axis designs on the Middle East gained credibility. The empire's vital arteries, the oil fields of Basra, the shipping lanes of the Red Sea, now pulsed under threat. Without Britain to hold them, the Middle East stood on the precipice of slipping into Axis influence. For the Dominions, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, the fracture was agonizing. Bound by loyalty to the Crown, they had sent men and resources to Britain's aid. Now, with the mother country occupied and its government relegated to exile in Ottawa, their futures diverged. Canada shouldered the heavy mantle of hosting Churchill's exiled cabinet, but even there, divisions grew. French Canadians questioned why their sons should die for an empire that no longer existed. Australia, threatened by Japan's rising power in the Pacific, wondered whether London could offer any protection at all. Many voices urged Canberra to turn toward Washington instead, though America's isolationist stance left little reassurance. The empire's cohesion, once anchored by Britain's might, disintegrated into doubt and self-preservation. In London itself, the empire's unraveling was visible in the propaganda war. German broadcasts sneered that Britain had abandoned its colonies, that its empire was a rotting carcass ripe for the taking. These claims found fertile ground abroad. Governors and colonial officials, cut off from London by disrupted communications, made decisions in isolation, some swearing continued loyalty, others opening secret channels to negotiate with Axis representatives. The empire, once united by telegraph lines and sea lanes, now existed as a patchwork of disconnected outposts. The long-term consequences of the fracture were irreversible. India's independence came not in 1947 after negotiation, but in the early 1940s through force and political rupture. Partition occurred under even more chaotic conditions as Axis-backed militias clashed with loyalist forces. Across Africa, nationalist movements gained momentum decades earlier than in our timeline, fueled by Britain's visible weakness. Ghana, Kenya, and Nigeria pressed for immediate autonomy, while South Africa charted its own course, drifting toward neutrality in the shadow of a German-dominated Europe. For the global balance of power, the collapse of Britain's empire accelerated the reordering of the 20th century. Germany, with Britain neutralized and its colonies destabilized, extended influence through proxies. Japan advanced through Southeast Asia unopposed, taking Singapore and Burma without the reinforcement of imperial troops. America, watching from afar, recognized that the age of European empires was ending, but lacked the will to fill the vacuum. Instead, the world fractured into spheres: a fascist Europe, an imperial Japan in Asia, and an isolated United States clinging to hemispheric defense. The Soviet Union, reeling under the onslaught of Barbarossa, saw no relief from a fractured empire. Without imperial forces tying down Axis armies in North Africa, without Commonwealth divisions at El Alamein, the Red Army stood alone. Stalin cursed Britain's collapse as betrayal, yet privately understood its inevitability. The fractured empire removed one of his last hopes of a counterbalance against Hitler's ambitions. In this alternate history, the Eastern Front became the sole crucible, a lonely struggle without Western pressure to draw German divisions away. In the decades that followed, the empire's collapse became a parable whispered among historians. Once the greatest power on earth, Britain's fall had not come from a single decisive battle, but from the steady erosion of its global fabric. With the heartland occupied, the arteries of empire withered. Independence movements surged not in gradual waves but in violent upheavals. By the 1950s, the British Empire was gone, swept aside 2 generations earlier than in our reality, its fragments scattered across a world reordered by fascist ascendancy. The fracture of the empire was not just the end of British dominance, it was the end of an era. The idea of empire itself, already strained, became untenable once Britain's own soil was under foreign boots. What followed was not a graceful decolonization, but a chaotic unraveling. And in that unraveling, the 20th century's trajectory shifted forever. Britain, the empire upon which the sun never set, instead cast the longest shadow of all, the shadow of collapse, stretching across continents, marking the end of an imperial age and the dawn of a darker world order. In the ruins of that imagined future, the map of the 20th century is unrecognizable. Democracies silenced, empires fractured, oceans no longer barriers but prisons. What had been the turning of the tide in our reality becomes, in this shadowed timeline, the drowning of an island and the extinguishing of hope. The Battle of Britain, remembered as a triumph of courage, instead becomes the fulcrum of defeat. And from that defeat rises a chilling truth, that the fate of generations can hinge on a few days of fire and steel in the skies above England.